All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the second day of Bricks and Dollars. I'm glad that you managed to make it through your breakfast and coffee to get here roughly in time. I'm not going to waste very much of it, although as it just informed me whenever I say I'm going to spend 5 minutes, it's going to end up being 10 minutes anyway. So my task for right now is to try and summarize what we thought we took away from yesterday to lead into the discussion for this morning and then the rest of today. I I don't think that's actually something that could be done, given the breadth and wealth of experiences, the details that we heard yesterday about stories from different countries, ranging from different countries in Africa all the way back to the UK through the course of the day. So I won't even try. But what I will try to do is to just make three quick points about issues that just stuck with me as things that I don't feel that we've quite resolved, and where we probably need to dig a little bit deeper and which we still need to figure out a little bit more. The first point is about this question of institutions. So we started out yesterday talking about the institutions of public investment management and what that entails. And in reality, probably the public investment management institutions are almost the same as the public financial management institutions, both because so much money actually passes through the public sector and through capital budgets that it would be very difficult to imagine a government that has stellar public investment management but absolutely atrocious public financial management otherwise. The second reason is that both the IMF and the World Bank are probably taking a very Catholic view when it comes to what is contained in the purview of public investment management, so it reaches very widely. Then we started to listen to different presentations about the experiences in countries. And of course, it turns out that even this very, very expansive definition is not expansive enough when it comes to the patterns of actual investment outcomes that you want to explain, because there are lots of other institutions that seem to be relevant and seem to have a bearing on how public investment management actually works, which are bureaucracy, public sector issues, and especially issues of accountability, openness, and democracy. So we were talking yesterday about the experience of Kenya, where that seems to be a very salient concern. And I think it's an interesting question. Halfway through the day, I was almost about to suggest to Richard that maybe Polity 4 or some other index of democracy should actually become part of the investment management suitability of countries and things that should be taken into consideration when private sector firms want to invest. However, there was a point that was being made very validly, I think, about the experience of China, for instance, where clearly accountability and the participation of members of local communities isn't exactly a priority, and it would be very hard to argue that the absence of democracy is a universal problem that inhibits infrastructure development in every single place in the world. So how do you trade off these kinds of issues is going to depend very much on the specific context of particular countries, where maybe in some cases the lack of accountability and oversight is a real inhibitor for progress. I'm saying this, of course, in a very non-normative way. Whether there would be other reasons to think about democracy and accountability is a completely different question. There are also issues about what specifically about public investment management are going to be the drivers and inhibitors of better investment performance. And I don't think we've quite cracked that, other than to say that we know that there's a big universe of potential factors that are going to be relevant. But in any particular country, so for instance, in Liberia, which part of this huge issue that we call institutions of public financial management and institutions of public sector management are going to be the thing that cracks it? We didn't get to that, but somebody probably ought to. The second point is about just specifically what is the nature of the investment management problem in any given country that we are going to be interested in. And again, yesterday in the evening, we were listening to Gordon Brown talk about mega projects, one mega project in particular, and there was, I thought, to me, the most interesting sentence that I heard in our last session was the statement about, and then there, but it's not just about the mega projects, there are also smaller projects that are maybe $1 billion, maybe 500 million, $300 million. I think if we are looking at the investment portfolio of many countries in Africa, especially where people are working, that's not really a small project. That's a mega project. The small projects that we are often looking at are $50,000, $80,000, $100,000, and there are thousands of them. And they're not being implemented. In many instances, they're not even being started for reasons of public financial management, for political reasons, and so on and so forth. But then, are these really the same kind of problems? Is the inability to construct an enormously sized hydropower project, is that the same as the ability to deliver hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rural roads every year? I don't think it really is. But then how do you distinguish between the problems and the solutions in a way that is actually meaningful and specific? And then the third point that I would like to make is about data. It's always easy. These days it's very fashionable to say we need more data and it's important that there be more data, and if there were more data then we could do more interesting things. Beyond the slightly trivial statement like that, let's just remember some of the presentations that we heard yesterday and how powerful it was to be able to show actual maps of road coverage and to be able to show actual statistics of all the projects that are being funded. This is the percentage of projects that are being started. I think I must have heard about 50 times yesterday somebody referring to Dan Rogers and paper on Nigeria, where they found that out of the thousands and thousands of tiny projects that were being funded over a 2-year period, 39% were never started. Out of the projects that were actually started, 25% were never finished. These are pretty serious numbers, and we're able to do these kinds of analyses because somebody spent a good part of 2 years digitizing actual project files in the presidency of Nigeria. There's loads more analytical work that we would be able to do if there was more information available like that. And I know that there are people sitting here in the audience who are already thinking about the next stage of what this type of research might look like. And it's very well going to affect our next stage of analytical approaches and the kind of advice that we are giving about what's really important. Because if we can say these things on the basis of actual evidence rather than just an educated guess about what might be important, our work is going to be so much better for it. And I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to leave those 3 thoughts with you for the day. We're going to pick all of this up at the end of today in the closing session. I should mention again that we're hoping that you're going to stick around for the rest of the day. The only reason why you should really be looking at your phone or your laptops during the sessions is, of course, to tweet about it, #2015Cape. We also have a graphic harvester who has been covering our work throughout the day yesterday, and you can now see some very interesting graphics that are emerging as you're walking to your coffee in the hallway. You've probably picked this up already. If not, I can only encourage you to take a look. It's over there on the back wall. There will be more coming on as we keep on talking during the day. And I see that Dinah's already getting antsy, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Already, he says. I'm 13 minutes behind. My name is Dinah McLeod, and late or not, it was an excellent summary from Philip. I am the Director of Strategic Development here at ODI, and that was quite a gallop through yesterday's incredibly packed and interesting agenda. I wanted to start with what my favorite quote, I think, of the whole day was, which was by my colleague Alistair McKechnie, and he said, "Building things is actually quite complicated." And I think that's absolutely the case. And this session takes it one level further, which is building things within cities is even more complicated and even more important. I've got some statistics to start off before we hand over to our panelists. By 2050, more than 2/3 of the world's population will live in cities, and 90% of that urbanization will occur in Asia and Africa. So development challenges are increasingly urbanized. So how is it that we're going to provide these kind of services, clean water and sanitation, and social social housing, and all the other things that come to make up urban infrastructure? And how on earth are we going to finance all of that? It gets even more complicated by the issues around climate change, which apparently urban areas at the moment account for 70% of the world's emissions. And as a result of that, the decisions that are made at the urban level are going to be the ones that either lock us into a high carbon growth path or a low carbon growth path. So we are going to be hearing from 4 panelists who are going to try and make sense of some of these issues from the urban point of view. We start off with Nick Godfrey, who's the head of policy and urban development for the New Climate Economy Project, and he sits along here in ODI with us. He has 10 years of experience in the public and private sectors, thinking about urban issues. Then we will follow with Marissa Moore, who is the Director of Urban Development Infrastructure at the National Treasury of South Africa. She spent nearly 10 years working on the housing and transport national budgets, and since then has also served as the Chief Director for Urban Development Infrastructure in the Public Finance Division of the National Treasury of South Africa. We have Zhu Liu, who has tried to teach me Cantonese this morning. I hope that was all right. He wears 2 hats. He is, first of all, the China Program Director at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and the Director also of the Peking University Lincoln Institute Center for Urban Development and Land Policy. And then finally, we have Jean-Paul Faguier, who is a professor of political economy and development at LSE. And he enjoyed this morning a taxi ride through London's infrastructure, so he was a little bit late. He's one of the world's authorities on decentralization. So I will start by presenting Nick Godfrey. Thank you very much. You have 15 minutes for your presentation. We look forward to that.
Thank you, Dinah. It's a real delight to be here this morning, and thank you very much for having me. And it's very kind to be invited by ODI, who are one of our key partners in the venture. So I wanted to just really try and provide a bit of framing for the discussion, because we're going to have a very rich discussion with some of my subsequent panelists. So what I wanted to do is just tell you a little bit about New Climate Economy. What is it? Then I'm going to dive into giving you a bit of a flavour of the work we've been doing on urbanisation, and a bit of an overview of some of the findings and conclusions on urban from of our Global Commission. So I mean, just to kick off, so New Climate Economy, it's essentially a international collaborative initiative that was commissioned by 7 national governments in late 2013, and is delivered through 8 core research institutes, including the Overseas Development Institute. This just gives you an idea of who sits on the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate. It's chaired by Felipe Calderon, the former president of Mexico, and has a range of luminaries across all walks of life and from different countries. So former heads of state, finance ministers, such as Trevor Manuel, a former finance minister under Nelson Mandela in South Africa. We have the number 2s at the World Bank and IMF, and various other business leaders from right across the world. And essentially the Global Commission was set up really to answer one single question. Is it possible to combine economic prosperity with climate action? And this really came out of, there's been many discussions in the environment sphere which seem to suggest that there's a potential trade-off between economic growth and inclusive economic growth and reducing carbon emissions. And so the Commission was set up to look at this essay question, and really concluded that there is actually a very strong intersection between inclusive, high-quality growth and climate action, and that there is an abundance of opportunity to run at. And the Commission really looked at 3 key drivers of change and 3 key systems: cities, land use, and energy. So I'm going to dive into the urban question in a bit more detail. So, I mean, we all know that cities are key drivers of growth. So, some statistics suggest that over 80% of the world's GDP emanates from urban areas. So really, we live in an urban economy, and over half of the world's population now live in cities, and as Dinah mentioned before, over 2/3 will live in cities by mid-century. And that urban growth is taking place in China and India and in the emerging world. So Africa's urban population is expected to triple by 2050. So 1 billion additional people will live in Africa's cities by the middle of the century. So a significant, overwhelming, huge structural and demographic shift we are seeing across the world right now. I mean, in addition, we know that cities are absolutely critical and at the heart of successful economic transformation. So I mean, this graph just essentially plots GDP per capita against the percentage of people living in cities. And you can see that over time, all countries that have successfully developed have all urbanized. And so there's a very strong connection between economic transformation and urbanization. The trouble is that when we look across the world, the predominant mode of urban development is characterized by urban sprawl and conventional motorization. So the global urban area is projected to triple by 2030, and that's equivalent to adding an area greater than the size of Manhattan every single day. I mean, that is an astonishing statistic. And if we also look at what's going to happen to the stock of motor cars, I mean, this is what it looked like in 1970. This is what it looks like round about now. We have about 1.2 billion cars on the roads. This is what it may look like by the middle of the century. So we see a pattern of urbanization characterized by urban sprawl and conventional motorization. And this is creating a whole bunch of economic, social, and environmental costs. So it's astonishing to think that none of the world's top 50 cities by population meet WHO air quality standards. I mean, that's pretty incredible in itself. And think about all of the health-related costs associated with that. Traffic congestion's costing many of the world's cities well in excess of 5% of GDP. Some of the latest statistics out of Beijing suggest that congestion is costing the city around about 15% of GDP per annum. And we in the Global Commission, we looked at the costs of urban sprawl in the United States alone, and that suggested that the cost to the United States economy equate to around $1 trillion per annum in terms of the monetized costs of air pollution, the increased public service delivery costs to more dispersed urban areas, and just think of the infrastructure requirements associated with that, and the private costs associated with vehicle travel. So, the key question here is, what type of urban future do we want to create? I mean, this is a picture of Mexico City, one of the most polluted cities in the world. Here's another example. Is this the type of urban future that we want to create moving forward? And, we found that this type of urbanization is creating economic and wider costs. And I won't dwell on this in any more detail, but this just gives a list of some of the issues that the Global Commission looked at. However, I think there is a very significant opportunity to do things differently, and particularly in the emerging and developing world. I made the point before, most of urban Africa is yet to be built. 50% of Africa's population will live in cities by 2035, and that is rapidly growing. So there's a very significant opportunity to get things right. And the Global Commission recommended 10 transformative actions, and one of those was encouraging the move towards more compact, efficient, connected cities with world-class public transport systems. And we looked at some of the economic benefits of this transformed model. Just in energy savings alone, we looked at the benefits of ambitious low-carbon urban actions in buildings, transport, and waste. And we showed that the economic opportunity is worth around about $17 trillion on a global basis out to 2050, based on energy savings alone. So taking into account the upfront investment costs, which are significant but manageable, this will generate savings in the region of $17 trillion in net present value terms out to 2050. So just in pure efficiency terms, it makes sense to plan our cities in a different way. But we also have to look very carefully at the structural form of cities and the transport systems that we build around them. So, I mean, this just gives you an example of Atlanta and Barcelona. So, I mean, these are two these are cities with very similar levels of wealth and population, but vastly different carbon productivities. In fact, there's a 7-fold difference in the carbon productivity just from the transport sector alone between the two cities. And this is very much based on urban form and the decisions made around investment in public transport infrastructure. So a different model of urban development is possible, and it has significant economic benefits. So this just gives you an idea of the economic benefits being generated by the bus rapid transit system in Johannesburg, which is at an early stage, and suggests that based on the benefits of time travel savings, improved road safety, increased physical activity, this can unlock benefits close to $1 billion. And this just makes a similar point. I mean, we know that the world's most competitive cities are those which have world-class public transport systems, and just think of all of the benefits related to reducing carbon emissions associated with that. And indeed, change is happening all around the world in many cities, which is the good news. This just gives an idea of the transformations that are happening in urban mobility. Over 200 cities now have bus rapid transit systems in place, which is transforming urban mobility. And it's important that change is accelerated and scaled up over time. So this just gives you an idea of the key recommendations of the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate that we made last year and submitted to the UN Secretary General, which are all about how do we unlock better urbanization through improving and providing greater fiscal autonomy to cities to unleash investment in smarter urban infrastructure, tax reform, regulatory reform, and improving planning and governance and financing models. I just want to conclude really and finalize with just making a couple of points about investment and urban infrastructure investment. It's going to be absolutely critical that we find ways to shift the current trajectory of infrastructure capital financing. So we looked at this issue, and the analysis suggests that $90 trillion in infrastructure capital will be spent over the next 15 years on a global basis, one way or another. And the key question is should we do that in a low carbon or a high carbon way? And we've shown that the incremental capital requirements of a low carbon transition are perfectly manageable, but requires some very significant attention to shift those capital flows. One of the key things which is going to be critical to this is improving the local ability of cities to generate revenue, to underpin their ability to attract private finance for investment in large-scale urban infrastructure, such as in the transport sector. And this just gives a couple of examples of very successful measures in this respect in Kampala and Lima, where significant increases in the local revenue base allowed those cities to secure a credit rating and therefore attract private capital and DFI capital into large-scale urban infrastructure projects. Finally, there's a really big opportunity here, but something's going seriously wrong at the heart of urbanization in many developing countries right now. This just gives you an idea of what's happening in Africa. So if we look on the left-hand side, we see what's happening across Latin America, where the increase in people moving to cities does generally seem to be associated with improved development outcomes. If you look at Africa on the right-hand side, a whole bunch of countries there, something seems to be going seriously wrong. And the correlation is breaking down. And so it really matters, the how is as important as the what, in the sense that it matters how you invest. Now, this just gives you an idea of what's happening in Lagos and Dar es Salaam. Both cities have put in place recently bus rapid transit systems. In Dar es Salaam, brand new bus fleet, world state of the art, etc. I mean, this just gives you an idea of what that is costing the city in terms of as a percentage of asset value. So is that solution appropriate for a city with a relatively limited fiscal base? And if you look at the comparative example in Lagos, where a different solution was proposed. So I'll leave it there. There's a fantastic opportunity to get cities right across the developing world. Urban infrastructure is going to be critical, but we've got to find a way to change the way that we think about planning, designing, and enabling our urban future. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. That was fantastic. That was an excellent introduction. Very much two halves there. I think I'm an optimist, and so the idea of most of urban Africa yet to be built is the takeaway message that I'm really hoping that we will focus on. But of course, there's so many challenges that you talked about. We will take the next couple of presentations. We'll dive to the city level and the country level after that rather macro presentation. We will begin by Marissa Moore. Marissa, you have the burden or the responsibility for dealing with the infrastructure needs that have been afforded over 20 years of apartheid legacy. And I would like to hear more of the ways in which you've had challenges and you've risen to that challenge. Thanks very much, Marissa.
Thanks, Dinah. Good morning, and thank you to the ODI for inviting me. I want to start with the stats that's been put out. Currently, South Africa is one of the most urban countries in Africa. We currently have 62% of our population of just over 50 million people live in cities in South Africa. Underlying this current trend is a history of a divided nation. And if we start thinking about the impact of a colonial and apartheid history and what that has done, has left us with a legacy of a divided cities, which has meant that there's unequal access to jobs, unequal access to amenities and public services. And despite us being a democratic country for a whole 21 years, we have been unable to break that legacy. The durability of spatial form, the unequal access to, in terms of income, I suppose vested interests have kept us in a divided urban space, and the impact of that has been that people have to suffer long distances to get to work. The carbon emissions are high. The productivity of our cities are negatively impacted by this spatial legacy, and cities themselves find it hard to be financially viable because of the cost of providing services in such a spatial dichotomy. The Constitution of South Africa makes it a municipal function to provide basic services and provide for social and economic opportunities and development for their citizens. And for the last 21 years, we've been largely focused on a backlog approach. So those households who've not been serviced, either in terms of water, electricity, basic services, but also healthcare and education was a primary focus. But that approach has kind of caught up with us, because the real pressure now is that growth, and especially urban growth, is demanding a response. So the idea that you can, as a state, respond to a backlogs approach is in a sense catching up with us. So growth, and especially refurbishment of infrastructure, is becoming a critical point. Maybe I should just show you what I've got here. So these are the backlogs that we're talking about. I was I was thinking this morning, it's interesting when politicians speak, they speak about what we've done, and when administrators speak, we speak about what we still have to do. So there's still significant backlogs in the country. It's not like we've addressed them all. Just under 20% of people are in need of decent housing. It's a constitutional responsibility to provide it. We provide it for free for low-income households. So we had a discussion yesterday about subsidies. Water supply, because of its impact on health, is of course still a big problem, as well as sanitation, which is one of our largest areas of backlogs. Around 24% of households don't have access to decent sanitation. Electricity is still an area that we need to be looking at, and it's also one of those backlogs that runs away from you. You keep on thinking you're getting there, and it keeps on growing. Also, in terms of roads, there's a differentiation between maintenance backlogs, which is a big problem now, but also some urban-rural differentiations where public service in the rural areas have got less access. So this is the space of the backlogs, but you can see on the growth side that there's a lot of pressure on our electricity and roads and water infrastructure to deal with growth. And the standard public finance approach that growth must pay for itself seems to be insignificant and not enough to address it. So this is the areas in which we would need to see increased investment, increased sustainable borrowing at city level, so that we can address these issues. A very similar graph to what Nick showed earlier, but quite stark, is when we look at the gross value add in South Africa, you'll see there's basically 5 cities that carries the country. Johannesburg, Tshwane, Ekurhuleni are all in the Gauteng region, and then Cape Town and eThekwini on the east coast. More than 50% of the gross value add in the country arises out of these cities. So it's a fundamental part of economic growth. I was asked to give a bit of a sense of what is the financing gap, and it was difficult. So the Treasury says the financing gap is 15, I must get my pounds right here, is 15 billion pounds over the next 10 years. Moody's is a lot more conservative. So Moody's says over the next 3 years, it's going to be like 1.2 billion pounds for investment in infrastructure. I suppose a good measure is to look at what cities have spent in the last 4 years, so from 2010 to 2014, about £6 billion was invested in infrastructure in these cities, and 60% of that investment comes from Johannesburg, Cape Town, and eThekwini, very largely impacted on by those BRT systems that you've just been showing, Nick. So if financing is part of the solution, and this just gives you a sense of the revenue sources in the different cities, maybe just an understanding. A is our metros, so the large metropolitan cities. B is smaller towns, or B1s. B2s and B3s are our rural areas and smaller towns, and B4s are our district municipalities. So I'm going to largely focus on A's because, as I showed you, that's where the bang for buck is in terms of public finance. Can we increase costs of service provision as a source for financing or for revenue to back this additional borrowing need? This is quite a tricky thing. Affordability is very constrained in our cities. Low-income households can spend between 10 and 19% of their household income on basic services. So there's very, very little space to increase revenue collection for services provided. There's some heavy subsidization in terms of those areas from the state. Lower income or higher income households is between 6 and 8% of household income is spent on services. Ironically, both of them driven by transport needs, because high income households are using private transport and low income housing have got low incomes. So the other approach is to look at assets. We currently have about 30 billion, if you look at a replacement value, 30 billion pounds of assets in our cities. And I suppose one good question is, how do we leverage those assets? What can cities do to ensure that they increase their ability to grow the value, to develop value? And to capture value, I think there was a lot of discussion yesterday about value capture in terms of spatial development, in terms of transport-oriented development, and how do we use land use management to start capturing the values of our investment. Johannesburg has initiated what the mayor calls corridors of freedom to identify certain areas of development across the city. And there are some opportunities there for transport investment to pool private sector investment and to provide for some income for the cities around those areas. An interesting story is we've built a high-speed train in the Gauteng area, and in round one, the not in my backyard approach was very, very stark. And I now believe that for possible extensions, people are coming to the developer asking if this train can please pass the area because they've seen the economic value of the investments. There are also ways in which cities can use PPPs or different rental agreements. In one of our smaller metropolitan cities, you've just hosted the World Cup, so you'll know what it takes to make it happen. But we've got some infrastructure left from the 2010 World Cup, and some of those have got interesting rental agreements where the income goes to a development agency for further investment in city infrastructure. So there are some ways in which cities can leverage those kind of assets. Hopefully cities will also venture into the area of green infrastructure to see the value of using the environment as a provider of clean water and energy. We have very, very good solar in South Africa, and the role of cities in providing feed-in tariffs and redistributing some of rooftop solar is definitely an area that cities can play a role in. When the financiers arrive in South Africa, they tend to go to the city and then come to the Treasury and ask for a guarantee. Cities are an independent part of our political system, so there are no guarantees from national to cities. So the projects themselves have to make sense and be viable. The regulatory framework is the Municipal Finance Management Act, which allows the municipal councils to decide on borrowing. I think as long as they do it in rands, then they can decide what they take on. There's some provision. You can see those red and green bars. Those are grants that are paid from national towards cities. And our Division of Revenue legislation allows for cities to pledge some of that money against future borrowing. But in that case, the Treasury must give approval, and we put a whole bunch of very high hurdles for cities to jump over before they're able to do that. But there is some provision. And then the MFMI also provides for the PPPs of municipalities. It requires that they speak to the responsible sectors and that the Treasury also provides some input in terms of longer-term partnerships where the risk is being shared. Lastly, on the regulatory side, the Treasury also provides capital budgeting guidelines for large projects to give a sense of how do you understand the need, how do you look at different options, what kind of feasibilities, cost-benefit or cost efficiency analysis is necessary for these kind of larger projects. Right, I also just wanted to leave you with a sense of what are the constraints, what is keeping us from going here. And I suppose the largest issue is similar to issues that the World Bank has identified in terms of the city's capacity to spend capital budgets, city's ability to maintain existing infrastructure. We see low expenditure on capital investment in cities, and it is, I suppose, one of the most frustrating areas in public finance is to see this constant under expenditure of capital budgets. I suppose if you look at some of the capacity constraints, it might become clearer. The the city's ability to put forward a proper borrowing strategy that's affordable to the city and its citizens, and also sustainable for the city to maintain is critical. You'll see there's some development charges in there. It's that sort of darkish brown color. The Treasury has given some guidelines in terms of how cities use development charges as a way to upfront pay for some of the larger investments in areas where there are the ability for citizens to contribute and for developers to pay some of the upfront capital costs. And then lastly, I think something that was raised a lot yesterday was looking at the project preparation facilities in municipalities so that we can move from just a statement of need to a project that understands its life cycle costing and understands the affordability of rolling it out both on operations and on a capital level. There are also skills issues, cities that are able to do proper financial management, proper strategic management. The issue of technical skills was raised yesterday in terms of engineering skills and the availability of those skills to cities is definitely remains an issue for us. However, it's not just the city to blame for the problems. Our constitution provides for what is called concurrent functions, where housing is shared between province and national, transport is shared between local, province and national, water is shared between national and local. And this makes a vertical alignment of infrastructure investment very difficult. And unfortunately, in a lot of instances, such as housing and possibly transport, those who make decisions on where investment must take place and the quality of investment don't feel the pain of bad decisions. So for us, it's always been a very important matter. The Constitution says you must bring the functions down to local level. Politicians are not keen to do that, so we are stuck in a world where not only do we not see the right decisions, we don't get the kind of accountability that you really want at a local level, and that also inhibits the ability to borrow, to invest in future infrastructure. The Treasury, in looking at these problems, have partnered with the World Bank, and we've created what we call the City Support Program to try and address some of these problems. In that program, what they've developed is what we call a municipal fiscal impact tool. This tool is supposed to look at the sort of life cycle costing of investments, understand the spatial impact of investment, but also understand the impact and who's paying for what. So you'll see in the first slide at the top, it breaks down the net present value, not just as a total value, but in terms of who will be paying to understand the affordability issue. It also breaks it up in terms of sectors, so it's going to be a high impact on water or electrification or transport costs. It makes sure that we understand what are the future operating costs, which especially on transport can be quite daunting. And it understands the environmental impact of what will this do to CO2 emissions, what will it do to water need, and what will it do to electrification requirements in that area. Just to end up is, in the longer term, as I said, the Treasury is very supportive of devolving functions, but we've been very hesitant to devolve tax powers. And thinking around a revenue source that is unique to metropolitan areas opens up not only the ability to borrow, but it also provides a greater sense of accountability when the local businesses are paying for, say, public transport and the buses are late, they will make a fuss. Whereas if the money just flows from National Treasury, nobody's going to know the better. So there's a big issue around accountability in terms of that. And as I said, it will also allow for cities to raise the kind of investment and financing that can help them support the basic services. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marissa. Absolutely fascinating set of problems that you have to deal with every day. And we're going to go across to the other side of the world now, to China with Xu Liu. And we need the clicker, Melissa. Thank you. Who is a proponent of the right kind of land-based financing, which he's going to give a little bit of an example of, but with a lot of health warnings about how you make those choices in land-based financing. Xu.
Okay, thank you. I thank the ODI to invite me here for discussion of infrastructure issues, which is actually the kind of issue that occupy much of my career when I work in the World Bank. I work much more in other countries than in China, but today I'm going to talk about China, which is a very unique example in terms of infrastructure investment and at the local government level. Okay, and just very quickly, I think everyone knows China developed city very fast. I mean, we had rapid urbanization, and 16 million people moved to the city every year for the last 10 years. But we also built the city very rapidly, so you can see the rapid transformation of Pudong in Shanghai, and from a kind of chaotic, mixed land use, rural and urban, to a major metropolitan center. And Shenzhen, entirely new city, and built 30 years ago, and now is a 12 million population metropolitan area. So that's what we see as the Chinese speed. Now, the country context is very unique. I think when we look at the Chinese way of developing cities and infrastructure, we need to keep in mind the political and economic structure. The governance structure in China is very unique, so sometimes it's not easy to compare China with other countries. There are several factors. One is that China is politically highly centralized. So basically, the big boss in the local level is appointed by the higher level government. And the local government officers have to perform well to achieve the performance target set by the higher level government in order to get a better chance to be promoted. So that's the kind of a political centralized system, and with a performance as the key measure for promotion. And then physically, and China is not very decentralized in the sense that tax power is remained with the central government, and local government do not have any tax power, and the category of tax and the tax rate all determined by the central government. So even today, the central government collect 46% of the national tax revenue, while local government collect 54%. But then in terms of expenditure, local government spend 85%, central government spend 15%. So the gap is mainly the intergovernmental transfer. So the central government take the revenue from the local government and then transfer part of the revenue back to local government for poverty reduction, for agriculture, for the western and region of China, which is lag behind in terms of the economic development. Now, in terms of land policy, we have a very unique arrangement. By the Constitution, urban land is state-owned, and rural land is collectively owned by the village. But only the state, represented by the municipal government, is given the power to expropriate the rural land for urban use. And this actually set the stage for the land-based finance in China for urban infrastructure development. Now, the last point in China is that actually China have gone through major economic reform in the 1980s and the 1990s. And the user pay principle, I mean, like it or not, and it's already the part of our daily life in China. And I mean, for a transition economy that go from every public service is like free to you, and you have to pay for basically everything. I think that this transformation was very critical, and China has completed this transformation. That's why the user pay principle helps China to generate finance for infrastructure, like a toll road and water supply and wastewater treatment plant also. Okay, very briefly to look at how the system works. We have a central government set the economic growth target every 5 years. And so when the central government think it's good for the country to achieve, let's say, 10% GDP growth rate for the next 5 years, and the target will just feed down to the local government. And so for every level of local government, and the leaders have to sit there to think about what they are going to do to achieve this GDP growth target. Now, the Chinese local government is an all-purpose government, and they take care of everything within their jurisdiction. And the mayor have to worry about employment and worry about how to attract foreign direct investment and other investment to the locality, and think about how to invest in public infrastructure, and also think about the real estate the development because of the rapid urbanization and also the rapid growth of personal income that create a demand for housing. And then finally, local government also try to find out the way to maximize the local tax revenue within the Chinese tax sharing system. Now, there are constraints for local government to do their job. And I just mentioned that there is no tax power for local government. When you think you need a piece of infrastructure, and if you don't have money, you cannot create a new tax category in order to come up with the fund for it. So that's one constraint. And the second constraint lasts until very recently. I mean, the old Chinese budget law did not allow local government to borrow directly from commercial banks. But the Chinese local government were very creative, and they find a way to get out of the constraint, and they have a few things to do in their toolkits. One is land concession, and I will talk about it a bit more. And the second is borrowing through the urban financing platform, which is created by the municipal government, but it's a state-owned enterprise under the business law domain, which allow them to borrow, but they borrow for the government. And finally, municipal government love to develop a real estate sector because much of the tax revenue from real estate sector are the local tax. So that's the way local government try to raise the fund for infrastructure. Now here, let's look at the revenue structure for local government. The green bar is the tax revenue for local government. The red bar is the revenue from land concession. Okay? Land concession is an operation where the municipal government expropriate the rural land and convert it to urban land and service it with infrastructure and auction the land out, the land use right out for real estate developer. So real estate developer basically bid for getting the land for real estate development at a very high price. And that price turned into the revenue to the local government. That's what we see as the red bar. And it's almost 50% of the tax revenue. Now, if we think the green bar is the kind of tax revenue for local government to do their job, it just barely pay the recurrent expenditure. Where the capital expenditure come from? It's from the red bar. I hear Marisa talking about very little capacity for capital investment. In China, that's not the case because we have a land concession revenue for that, and it come out huge amount of money. Okay? But this is based on the government policy that set very low land acquisition cost that's given to the farmer. So basically today we know the urban sector squeeze the rural sector to pay for the urban development. Now today we know this land-based financing, I mean two things. One is land concession revenue. Another is the local borrowing through the local financing platform. Often use land as the collateral, and that's what we have for the local financing. And over time, it caused a lot of economics and social problem. Today, we run into major issues like urban housing price. Today in Beijing, the price-income ratio is over 30, which means the average person have to save every penny for the next 30 years in order to buy an apartment that he would need in the average quality level. So that's the high housing price problem in China. But on the other hand, over the last 10 to 15 years, many households actually bought a lot of housing because the Chinese savings is high. And for the household, there are very few attractive alternatives. Stock market is very risky, and putting the money in the commercial bank, interest rate is regulated much lower and cannot catch up with the inflation. And the Chinese RMB cannot be easily converted into international currency, so you can buy property outside China. So most Chinese households just use their saving to buy a house. And now the big housing vacancy rate is another major issue. And today our real estate sector has already cooling down a bit. So in the future, we worry about the economic growth rate because real estate is also a significant part of the economy. And local debt. Local government use the financing platform to borrow with using land as collateral. And over time, the local debt piling up very quickly, and today is the local debt, outstanding local debt is about 1/4 of the national GDP. And then more importantly is the social tension between the farmers and the municipal government. Because the farmers are not happy for the land taken by the cities, and overnight the land value the increase by 10 times, while the farmers feel they get so little. So there are a lot of social unrest, the movement going on in China, and that actually undermines the stability of the society. And then we also have a major issue in the inefficient use of land, and cities want to get more money from land concession. So sometimes they do the land operation and by deviating from the real demand. So finally, the city get a lot of land, while the real estate demand is not very much there. So you see the land get converted to urban use, but just sit there without a real development. So these are the kind of issue we are facing. Now, the Chinese government actually understand all this problem. It's time for us to clean up. And 2 years ago, the central government announced a new round of economic reform with a few things that's related to our urban problem. I mean, first, the reform is land reform, and the Chinese government want to establish integrated urban and rural construction land. So we are not going to treat the rural land differently from urban land. And the second is to reform the municipal financing. And we are trying to introduce the property taxation as a main source of municipal financing in the future. And we also try to change the municipal financing framework and allow the local government to issue bonds in the capital market. And recently we had a major amendment of the budget law which allowed the local government to borrow. But unfortunately, the law seemed to close the door for other the commercial borrowings by the local government. So the challenge will go on for the next few years. And I'm not going to get into more detail, and just to summarize, and I would say the following points. First of all, infrastructure is a part of the broad development strategy in China. And there is a very strong central planning, which I think is crucial for infrastructure development. But there is also very strong local incentive. And we have the bureaucratic accountability for the implementation of infrastructure. So that's why, I mean, the implementation in China is always very fast. And land-based financing is the major financial vehicle for China, but it's not very sustainable now. And so today, our lesson learned is that we rely on land-based finance, achieve a lot of development in China, but we overdo it in the drive for rapid GDP growth. So it's time to clean up, and we learn how we pay the cost for the excessive use of land-based financing. If the Chinese experience can be anything for, let's say, African countries or so, I would say land-based financing is wonderful, but please do it right, and don't overdo it. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating look. I'm just thinking of that poor mayor with all the choices that he or she has to make. It's really interesting to put that human dimension onto all these financing choices. We are going to go now, after our two country-based presentations, we're going to go back into some theory. So Jean-Paul, you've just edited a book called Is Decentralization Good for Development? So perhaps you could tell us whether it is or not.
Perfect, thank you. Can I walk around, Dinah?
Yes, of course.
I find it hard to sit still and talk at the same time. Yeah, thank you. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dinah and Philip and Tom for this invitation to speak here. So we have just published this book just last month with my co-editor, Calvin Fusher, a very, very recent PhD graduate and my former student from the LSE. And so I'm going to be speaking about one or two things from this book. There's a great deal more in the book, which we're going to launch on the 2nd of December at the LSE in a big public lecture. So you're all welcome if anyone isn't bored silly by this talk now. But we'll be going into much more detail and discuss it in the panel.
We'll just wait for the handheld.
Oh, yes, okay, sure. Okay, great, thank you. A lot of these issues are also treated in a special issue of World Development from 2014 called Decentralization and Governance. I'll just flag that for those who want to go deeper into these sorts of things. The background to this is that the field of decentralization and fiscal federalism shows increasing technical rigor over time, which is a very good thing. If you compare back with the studies of 30, 40 years ago, they were very qualitative and they were not very well specified, and they've been criticized in a number of ways along those lines. But at the expense, two expenses in particular, which we focus on in this book, which is one, narrowing on quantifiables. So studies are a lot of evaluations of the effects of decentralization on things that you can easily quantify, which is part of the flip side of greater technical rigor. And then, of course, also ignoring larger, more nuanced, complex questions, which tend to be the first order preoccupations of policymakers who must decide to decentralize. Right? So policymakers, politicians who decide to do a decentralization are not, with the greatest respect, typically thinking of increasing efficiency or lowering unit costs. They're worried about getting reelected in democracies. They're worried about what it'll do to political stability in their country. They're worried about whether it's going to increase or decrease the chances of their parties and the people coming behind them riding their coattails to win elections and dominate government or not at the national and local level. And these things you can't really run through regressions and regression discontinuities and instrumental variables because it's not that kind of question. So we try to return attention to these kinds of complex, nuanced questions that are more in policymakers' primary remit or primary preoccupation by writing this book with, through a marriage, a very difficult, fretful marriage of academics and senior policymakers who have done decentralization in developing countries. And it was very difficult, and it took 6 years to do, because we don't think, policymakers and academics don't think in the same language, we don't proceed in the same way. And we tend to exasperate each other continuously. But I think the product of sustained attention, I hope, is worth the effort that we put into it. Some of the broad questions that we look at are things like, why do politicians decentralize in the first place? The idea that an elected politician would decentralize as one of the first orders of businesses having taken power is a logical absurdity. So it's a question that actually demands to be answered. Once they have taken a decision to do things, how do they make it politically feasible? So even if you have a Nelson Mandela, for example, in power, who wants to do something good for the people, for his country, because that's what he wants, how does he carry his party and the bureaucracy? These aren't straightforward questions. Other questions along these lines, the ones I'll focus on for the rest of this short talk are down here, hopefully in sympathy with my colleagues on the table this morning. How do you design fiscal hierarchies, meaning fiscal systems of taxation, transfer, and expenditure amongst different levels of government to achieve these sorts of goals for efficiency, for growth, and for fiscal and macroeconomic stability? So the first thing, so how should expenditure and revenue be assigned across levels of government? So the first order of the day is that fiscal theory and decentralization theory tells us a lot about this, about how we can answer these sorts of questions. From fiscal federalist theory, public services with locally specific benefits, heterogeneous demand, where local information, local time and place information, in the nice phrase of Elinor Ostrom, are important to their production, and that have low-scale economies should be devolved. Now that's a huge mouthful, so I'm summarizing 50 years of theorizing about these sorts of things in one sentence. Public services that have locally specific benefits, meaning relatively low spillovers. So this would be, for example, primary education as distinct from tertiary university education or advanced technical training. Primary health care, vaccinations, attending births and deaths, primary health interventions that you can do in small clinics as distinct from complex things that you do in big hospitals. Local roads and not trunk roads and highways, for example. Where local information is important. It is simply the case that different kinds of services that operate at different levels of complexity require more or less local information in the production of those services for their success. This is just a simple empirical regularity. Where economies are high or low. So on the one hand, you have spillovers, which might be broad or narrow, and on the other hand, you have economies of scale in the production of a good, which might be large or small. So where these things line up in this way, it makes sense to devolve responsibility for their production, meaning expenditure responsibility, down to lower levels of government and decentralize them. This is called the encompassing principle. The Oates proposed this as the encompassing principle. Additionally, local governments are better at eliciting preferences and also this Ostrom-like time and place information. Right? It is for reasons which we can get into in the Q&A if you'd like, but it makes sense from an incentive point of view to conclude that local governments have more and more powerful and more consistent incentives to find out what is the information about what needs are locally, and also relevant information that raises the efficiency of the production of primary education, local roads, small-scale irrigation projects, for example, than do central government officials in the same sectors. And so it makes sense to devolve expenditure and responsibility for the production of that good down to local levels. But local taxes are always constrained by neutrality, by equity, and by mobility. There's only so much that you can raise, for example, property taxes or corporate taxes before businesses start to relocate as a function of taxes, of different tax rates at local levels. So it makes sense that we were listening to the Chinese case just now. There's a logical reason why taxation should be relatively more centralized and expenditure should be relatively more decentralized, which means systematically across countries, expenditure responsibility tends to exceed local tax capacity, the local tax base, which means that transfers are always going to be part of the system. It makes sense for transfers to be an important part of the expenditure system in any sort of federation, in any sort of country. If the benefits spill over onto wider populations, higher level taxes should pay for those sorts of services because the central government internalizes externalities and also levies broader based taxes, right? So again, this is the basic case for transfers. Intergovernmental transfers can also correct for vertical imbalances and for horizontal imbalances. So the vertical imbalances are the differences between taxation, capacity, and expenditure responsibility. The horizontal imbalances, horizontal inequalities, are between richer and poorer places. So if we're talking about primary schools, for example, we don't want one locality to be able to finance lavish local schools because they're a richer locality, and next door the poor place cannot, and then those children get systematically worse and less education and remain poor. We want to try to equalize those horizontal inequalities, and again, that's a role for central government, not local government, right? So then how do we calibrate these intergovernmental transfers? Well, they have to be large enough to sustain local services, so that we have some measure of equity in, for example, primary health care, primary health provision across rich and poor places, but not so large that local governments become transfer dependent. We'll come back to that in a moment with the Latin American case. So these sound like some nice sort of higher order generalities that support a number of countries' fiscal systems at a very broad level, but it leaves a huge amount unanswered, right? Because it's so general and it's so high level. So this is where chapter 7 comes in this book by Caroline, by Puschel and Weingast, Barry Weingast of Stanford. They start to delve further into the political economy of it and not just the fiscal theory of these questions by noting that the distribution of tax, powers, responsibilities, and resources shape policy choice and economic performance in deep and powerful ways across countries. So it's not just a question of service provision, externalities, economies of scale. It actually goes much beyond that. For example, transfer formulas can provide incentives to collect local taxes by tying central government transfers to tax efforts. Right? Tax motivation can incentivize growth-promoting policies and investments and greater sensitivity to residents' needs and better fiscal discipline. So you can have deep effects that go towards economic growth across the country and also macroeconomic stability and fiscal stability via these transfer regimes and via the fine calibration of these transfer regimes. By contrast, when you have fiscal dependence on central transfers, you tend to get the opposite outcome across this range of dimensions in terms of growth, in terms of macro stability, in terms of unsustainable deficits. So these are very powerful effects, and there are additional things that we need to think about beyond just the budget function of where you tax and where you spend. Some evidence on some of these effects from Chapter 5 by two colleagues looking at Latin America, Gracia and Jaramillo. Decentralization in Argentina and Brazil in particular, although they look in their chapter at all of Latin America, but let's just focus on these two countries for a moment. In the 1990s, were expected to improve public efficiency, and instead, they led to explosions of decentralized expenditure and fiscal deficits. Right? There's a lack of clarity, there was a lack of clarity in the division of responsibilities between the central and local levels of government, which led to periodic bailouts, creating what they call a fiscal tragedy of the commons problem with intrinsic and systematic moral hazard. This led to huge fiscal debts and severe macroeconomic problems. So what did they do? Well, reasonably, intelligently, they adjusted, both Argentina and Brazil, and actually Colombia and Peru and other countries in the region as well. So we had fiscal responsibility laws in Argentina and Brazil that set limits on subnational spending and borrowing. Stringent accounting rules that increase transparency and control of accounts, and more autonomy to raise local revenues, which led to more fiscally responsive behavior. So let me highlight one thing in particular, which is really important. They did not roll back decentralization. This was not saying, oops, we made a mistake, we gave the localities too much money, too much authority, let's take it back to the center. They did a little bit of both. They did a bit of that in terms of oversight and control. They did a lot of transparency, but they also devolved more autonomy to raise local revenues. And together, these things led to far more fiscally responsive behavior. So it's not a systematic move towards more centralization or towards more decentralization. It's a rejigging of the system. It's a multidimensional calibration of the system along these lines that we're talking about. You can see some of the effects here. So decentralization is happening in Latin America in roughly the early to mid-90s. So Colombia decentralizes between 1991 and 93 with a new constitution. Bolivia decentralizes quite sharply in 1994. Argentina and Brazil between 94 and 95. And you can see, on the one hand, that total expenditures go up, the blue line, dramatically. Total national expenditures of the entire public sector in these countries. And the overall balance, meaning fiscal deficits, balloon. Right? So we go from relatively low to increasing and then to hugely increasing fiscal deficits. And just about here, they start to get control of it. And so the rise in expenditure plateaus, and that's when the fiscal responsibility laws come in. Right? And they come in slightly different years. It's not exactly the same day in all of these countries, but it happens in the early 2000s. And you see that fiscal expenditure plateaus. And then balloons again, but this is the effect of the 2008 crisis, which happened all over the world. So that's no longer a subnational story. To underline this, the Argentine economic explosion around 2000, 2001 is popularly thought, if you read the newspapers, to be a product of the dollar peg, the peso being pegged to the dollar, right? The currency board under Menem that maintained a dollar-peso peg. That undoubtedly is part of the story, but it's just one part of the story. What actually, it's not the major part of the story. It was the breaking of the peg was the main effect of the currency collapse, the fiscal collapse. What actually drove the fiscal collapse was subnational spending at the provincial level. So the Argentine provinces were spending like there was no tomorrow. And because of the political coalition that kept the Peronists in power centrally, meaning Carlos Menem, they had to absorb all the subnational deficits. And so when the subnational deficits ballooned, the national deficit ballooned, and that's what blew up. And that's when they had to break the peg. Breaking the peg was a result of the fiscal crisis, not the other way around. This is well established. This isn't my claim. This This is actually, there's an important article in that special issue that talks about that directly, but it's a well-established empirical fact. So now to close, what can we take away from this? My students go crazy when they hear me say this. Well, that's an exaggeration, but they always complain. They say, it depends. All you say is that it depends. It does depend. It depends in particular on country characteristics. So there is no optimal design in the sense of a blueprint or a cookie-cutter design that I can give you about local tax levels should be this level and central tax levels should be, or tax authority should be at the other level, and then expenditure should be divided, 70% locally, 30% centrally. We can't give you those sorts of guidelines across countries because countries differ in powerful and important ways. There's no consensus about ideal intergovernmental distributions. There are these higher level considerations, these higher level rules or regularities that we've been talking about, which are true. But that leaves a lot of space for maneuver for particular countries and particular regimes. There is empirically enormous variation across countries in these arrangements, not least because we're talking about multidimensional things, and you can get stable complexes of policies, responsibilities, tax levels, etc., that are stable and reasonable, but that vary across countries, because the country characteristics differ, but also because one country has this kind of political system and this tax level and this expenditure, and that all makes sense. In a different country, you have a different political system, and taxation is divided differently, but expenditure is also divided differently, and so multidimensional complexes are stable, but they differ from one to another. So that is as it should be. There's no common model, and there shouldn't be a common model. Fiscal arrangements should be tailored to a country's fiscal, political, and economic characteristics, and should be expected to differ as much as the countries differ themselves. So what can we do as academics? We can lay out trade-offs clearly and analyze the consequences of different choices in real episodes of reform. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Really interesting presentation to elegantly summarize some of the trade-offs involved. Take some questions from the audience now. I think what I will do is take questions in sets of 3, and then we'll go to the audience. I'll allocate them among the panel members, unless you have a particular person in mind. And I'll just go from this part of the room to the other. Gentleman over there, then there, and then there, and then we'll go across.